Thank you so much. What an absolute pleasure. And just to add my heartfelt thanks for the last 3 days. It's been phenomenal. I'm already looking forward to watching everybody's presentation again and imagining a book. So I'll just launch right into session 9. I'm absolutely delighted to be moderating this session and really looking forward to the papers. But we'll move on to the second presenter today, and that is Alexandra Lembke-Ross from the University of Lund. And the title of their paper is From the Midwife to a Gladiator, Natality in the Passion of Perpetua and Felicity. So if you'd like to take over to you, Alexandra.
Hello, and thank you to Martina for the introduction. My name is Alexandra. Today my talk will be expanding on my master's thesis that I wrote at the University of Lund. And I found out a few days ago that I'm going to continue studying the maternal body this autumn in a Marie Curie doctoral fellowship at the University of Bamberg. So exciting things to come. I'm also in my 3rd trimester of pregnancy, so these things are on my mind in more ways than one. I'll just share my screen now. Please let me know if there's any issues with that. Okay. So 2 women stand at the center of the arena, one with swollen breasts, dripping with milk, and a belly softened by recent childbirth. The beasts are impatient, and the crowd is frenzied. Both have a taste for blood. Everything stills and quiets when the spectators look upon these 2 bodies and notice that they are mothers. A shudder ripples through the audience. At the climax of the passion of Perpetua and Felicity, the maternal body stands at the center of the gladiatorial arena and the narrative arc. The attention of the spectators and of us as readers is fixed upon the maternal body. But part of the story, this part, in fact, is not narrated by Perpetua, but by an editor who wrote the epilogue to her diary sometime afterwards. Perpetua's diary is said to have been written around the year 202 or 203 AD. It is one of the very few voices of a mother that has survived from antiquity. The diary is her account of life in prison and whilst she's on trial as she awaits her death in the gladiatorial arena. Perpetua wrote about the stress of trying to care for her child while she was imprisoned. She writes about difficulties in trying to arrange for their custody. She writes about her fears around suffering from mastitis when she is forced to abruptly stop breastfeeding. She complains that the prison is hot and crowded and that she has never known such darkness. But when she finally gets permission for her baby to stay with her, she feels that the prison has become a palace. Perpetua's maternal body is central to the text. Breastfeeding, weaning, caring, and dreaming. She, in fact, records her mystical visions as dreams in her diary. The maternal body also pervades the figurative language of the text. Her diary is a tapestry of maternal imagery. Metaphors and similes and allegories are all braided over each other and tie Perpetua's performance of Christian martyrdom closely to her maternal body. So Perpetua's diary comes down to us in the form of manuscripts that were written a long while after her death. And these manuscripts, as I outline on the slide here, come in 4 parts. We have a prologue and an epilogue that have us form a kind of framing narrative around her story. That the prologue introduces her as a Roman noblewoman, and the epilogue details her death in the arena alongside an enslaved woman named Felicity, who has recently given birth. What I think is interesting is that we find the editor describes the maternal body in very different terms to Perpetua herself. They soften her edges and smooth over her acts of resistance. Therefore, I argue that the prison diary of Perpetua The prologue and the epilogue should be read as separate texts. Here I take my cue from the historian Kate Cooper. I also identify the distinct tensions between the framing narrative and the prison diary, and then I consider these different voices with different commitments. I think this is especially evident in that Perpetua and the editor express different views of the maternal body, and thus a very different understanding of natality. So why is this important? When I first read Perpetua's diary, I was surprised to learn that for millennia, Perpetua's story was read as a repudiation of motherhood in favor of the holier path, that of the virgin martyr. I believe that this binary between the virgin martyr and the mother is best summarized by the theologian Carrie Friedrich Frost, who writes that writers of the early church were invested in their defense of virginity as the superior mode of Christian life. As one consequence of this way of thinking, consecrated virginity was valorized at the expense of family life, including motherhood, which led to a negative view of the human body and sexuality, particularly the maternal body. I think that a matricentric reading of Perpetua's diary, one that foregrounds her own understanding of her body, might help us unstitch this negative view of the human body and sexuality that remains embedded in our culture today. To demonstrate this, I would like to zoom in on just one image in the text, and that is Colostrum, to compare how it is seen and understood by Perpetua herself and the editor in the epilogue. So we will begin our reading here in what I think is the most metaphorically fertile of the text passages, which is the first of Perpetua's dreams. Perpetua writes of her vision of an idyllic pastoral scene, as we can see written here, where she comes across a shepherd milking a goat, who then offers her a mouthful of cheese. This dream has layers and images of new life and paradise, the Eucharist and baptism. And in the context in which Perpetua writes, which was 3rd century Roman Carthage, readers could have maybe passed through these layers of metaphor to recognize the passage as both intrinsically Christian and intrinsically maternal. Baptism at the time was closely tied to images of the maternal body and conception. Just as new life is created in the womb, it was understood that a neophyte received new life through Mother Church and the font of her womb. However, there's little to suggest the maternal body in this passage, at least for a modern reader. But in an ancient understanding of gynecology, the word cheese here takes on new significance. The translation of the word cheese has stumped translators over time. In fact, many prefer to translate cassio in the Latin simply to mean milk, as it makes more sense in the context because it's freshly milked from the goat. But Elizabeth Klein, in her analysis, makes a strong argument for sticking with the more literal translation to cheese, as it has important metaphorical connotations within late antiquity. For instance, in writing on the generation of animals, Aristotle articulates a peculiar understanding of conception. In the biological understanding of the time, a baby was conceived by semen coagulating the blood of the womb. Thereby, it was thought the addition of semen would solidify the blood in the womb, and from this mass, a baby was conceived. The coagulation of milk into cheese became an allegory for this process. For the milk to solidify into cheese, it has to be rennet needs to be added to the milk. And when they mixed, they created something new, cheese. So Aristotle thus uses cheese as a metaphor for the process of conception. Klein points to other, especially Christian authors, who take up this image as a metaphor for the creation of new life, and thus baptism. To expand on Klein's thesis, I think it's also interesting to consider this passage in the light of ancient medical authors' writings, particularly Soranus, when they write on Colostrum. As a breastfeeding mother, Perpetua's preoccupation with feeding and then weaning her child is woven through the text. The use of the word cheese in this passage could be reflective of this. Serranus describes Colostrum as being thick and very cheesy. The confusion that translators have faced when confronted with this passage might be resolved by considering colostrum rather than milk as the substance that the shepherd offers to Perpetua. This would be in keeping with both the breastfeeding motif that is laced throughout the text and a contextual understanding of the interconnectedness of baptism, new life, and the maternal body. This is in contrast to the epilogue. Here we can contrast Perpetua's view of colostrum with that of the editor. The editor writes that in the opening scene that I opened this talk with, that the crowd shuddered, seeing that one of the women was a delicate young girl and the other had recently given birth, as her breast was still dripping with milk. So in the editor's telling, Perpetua's maternity is completely erased. Instead, she is described as a young girl, while Felicity's maternal body is portrayed as an object of shock and repulsion. In their analysis of the scene, the historians Stavroula Constantinou, Naspasias Kouroumoni, Stavrinou emphasize the fact that as Felicity has so recently given birth, the milk dripping from her breast is best understood as colostrum. When we read intertextually with Serranus, this further adds to the sense of revulsion that pervades the passage. Serranus strongly warns his readers against feeding newborns colostrum. We can see that in his quote here from Gynecology. He instead advocates for the use of a wet nurse. He explains his physiological and moral reasoning for this, writing, "The maternal milk is in most cases bad, thick, very cheesy, hard to digest, raw, and not mature." This takes on a more moral element where he talks about it being produced by bodies in a bad state, agitated, and changed to the extent that we see the body altered after the delivery, which has suffered a great discharge of blood, is dried up, toneless, discolored, and feverish. Rather than an image of new life, Serranus portrays colostrum as a substance of contamination and danger. Constantinou and Kouroumoni Stavrinou highlight the fact that in Serranus's view, the evilness is determined by two factors: its texture and its producer. The state of the mother is reflective in the quality of her milk. Milk and uterine blood were intimately connected in an ancient understanding of the maternal body. Thus, the view that Serranus expresses here, and that was widespread in late antiquity, sees the first milk as contaminated and polluted by lochia, which is the vaginal discharge of blood and uterine tissue that follows birth. By examining the image of colostrum in the text, it becomes evident that whilst Perpetua's ideas of maternity were intimately connected to her spirituality and to her martyrdom, the editor instead reflects a view of the maternal body as polluted and dangerous. In Perpetua's telling, she becomes a martyr through, rather than despite, her maternal body. In the narrator's view, or the editor's view, the maternal body is instead a hindrance to, rather than a locus of the women's martyrdom. This is reflective of the aesthetic ideal of the virgin martyr that was valorized within early Christian writing and theology. Through this lens, the way that Perpetua uses the image of colostrum in her writing speaks to a self-defined view of mothering and its role in her martyrdom. We can see this view of, I think here the terminology from matricentric theory is really important in seeing mothering as a self-defined act and motherhood as an institution that is patriarchally defined. We can see a reflection of this on the other, for instance, in the way the editor reflects a more patriarchal view of both colostrum and motherhood, and sees it as something that stands between the two women and their fate as martyrs. This provides further evidence that Perpetua and her editor had different motivations for writing her story. It is also evidence that Perpetua herself and the editor who wrote her epilogue had different views of natality that expressed within their respective texts. And it highlights the need to read the text separately and at times in contrast to one another. As one of the very few records of an ancient woman's voice that has remained with us from late antiquity, it is especially important that we as scholars separate Perpetua's writing from that of her editor to truly listen to her story as she herself tells it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. That was amazing and wonderfully rich. And huge congratulations on your PhD. And I'm very excited for you and looking forward to that on your behalf. So that's wonderful news.